This evening, we have as our guest Fire Chief B. Michael Thurlow, who is a lifelong Scarborough resident who graduated from Scarborough High School and attended Southern Maine Community College. He followed in the footsteps of his grandfather and uncles by joining the Scarborough Fire Department as soon as he was old enough, at the age of 16. Michael has served as a member of the Pine Point Fire Company for nearly 45 years. He was appointed the town's first part-time emergency management director in 1980, a position he has now held for 40 years. 4 days after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, Michael was appointed as Scarborough's career fire chief. Michael is married to his wife of 33 years, Malvina, and they have a son, Michael, who was the fourth generation of the family to serve on the fire department and now serves as a career Scarborough police officer. We welcome you, Mike.
A wonderful evening, and thank you for the kind introduction, Nancy. As Nancy mentioned, I am a lifelong resident. I'm working on my 45th year as a member of the Scarborough Fire Department, and I've been Scarborough's local EMA director now for 40 years, and the last 19 plus years as fire chief. So I'm hoping that I can bring you a little bit of a perspective of some history here as well on the real history of Scarborough and the emergency management program as we go along tonight. So we're going to talk about the changes and in the principles and practices between the time frame of the book that you read about, the 1964 earthquake in Alaska, and kind of how we're doing things today around emergency management. I've broken the program down into 3 sections. So we'll start with emergency management principles and practices. I'll take a few questions at the end of that. Then we'll talk about some personal preparedness tips. And then we'll finish up the evening with some resiliency skills. So emergency management, I think it's nice to start with a little bit of a history lesson. Civil defense started back at the beginning of the Cold War. It was a division of the Department of Defense, and a lot of you probably recognize some of the symbols that are on this slide of fallout shelters and the old civil defense literature, and some of the ads, Bert the Turtle and the duck and cover drills of the 50s and 60s. The focus back in the early part of civil defense was really on bomb shelters and the nuclear bomb threat. There were a number of public awareness campaigns. The duck and cover was one I can even remember as a child doing in elementary school. Over the years, civil defense turned into the Civil Emergency Preparedness Agency. That's kind of when I was old enough to start getting into it in the mid to late 70s and early 80s. But even as recent as the 1980s and into the 90s, the picture on the bottom right of this slide shows a Geiger counter. And one of the things that I had to do as Scarborough's local emergency management director was actually on a monthly basis monitor the background radiation in Scarborough. And we had 4 different locations throughout town, and I would take that Geiger counter, put the headsets on and count the clicks, and I had a form that I had to fill out and actually submit to the county emergency management agency, and it went right up through the state. Part of that was we had Maine Yankee back in those days, and we wanted to monitor the background radiation in case there was an undetected leak up there. But this all came from the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war. So today's system really looks a lot different. As I mentioned earlier, it started with the Department of Defense. Since 9/11, the terrorist attacks, now it's under the new Department of Homeland Security. And the focus has really evolved to deal more with natural and man-made disasters. The system interfaces between the different agencies. In the top right, you see FEMA is at the head of it, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Then each state has a state agency, each county has a county agency, and then of course each local community has their own local emergency management capabilities. And that's how the modern system works. There's 4 main cycles or phases of emergency management. we all start with preparedness, and that really is the bulk of what we do. We generate emergency plans, we look into different contingencies and memorandums of understanding with resource partners, those types of things. Then when we have an event, we go into a response mode and we deal with protecting the public and working with the public safety agencies. Then once the incident is over, we go into the recovery phase. That's where we, get roads open and start getting back to normal. And then we go through a mitigation phase, which mitigation really just means making things better to prevent losses in the future. So a simple example is if a road floods during a significant storm, then one of the mitigation tactics may be that we put a larger culvert in or a bigger bridge to help handle the water in the future so that it doesn't destroy the road that it did during this particular storm. And then we start all over again, preparing for the next event. One of the credos of emergency management is that all disasters are local. We start every response and our work at the local level. And as I mentioned before, we have mutual aid agreements and MOUs with our public safety partners and neighbors, some of the larger facilities in town, the grocery stores and Lowe's and Home Depot and places like that, where we can use their parking lots as necessary for points of distribution and gain materials that we may need to help mitigate or respond to the threat. Once we've exhausted those local resources, the next step is mutual aid. So we use our mutual aid resources. And then beyond that, we go to the county. And the county doesn't have many resources of their own, but they have resources beyond the capabilities of the local communities and our mutual aid partners. And they're our conduit to the state emergency management agency, which has their own state assets, be it the state police, the Forest Service, the National Guard, that they can bring into play and assistance. And then finally, when the state exceeds its capabilities, we go to FEMA. And that takes the form of federal disaster assistance teams. Those are teams that are set up in advance, and there's a whole process where where states can request federal assistance for teams for a variety of different things. One of the other things that FEMA does that's noted on this slide is the Stafford Act funding. There's been a federal law for a number of years now where when communities like Scarborough incur cost mitigating a presidentially declared disaster, the Stafford Act provides 75% reimbursement to the communities for those specific costs. And then generally the state of Maine kicks in 15% and the local community is left with a 10% local match. Over the years, that's been tremendously helpful for the town. I thought I'd just give you 2 or 3 examples of some of the local emergencies or disasters that we have dealt with as an emergency management agency in Scarborough, and a lot of these were widespread, so it also involved those of you from Cape and South Portland and surrounding communities. One of the big ones was Hurricane Bob back in 1991. Our federal reimbursement for that for the community was just short of $130,000. It occurred back in August of 1991. It was a Category 3 hurricane. We got about 8 inches of rain in Portland. The winds exceeded 70 miles an hour sustained. There was widespread flooding, many trees and roads closed, trees down and roads closed, widespread power outages. During this event, the reason I put it on here, 3,500 residents evacuated, and we actually had 1,500 citizens in our public shelter at the high school. It's the largest sheltering operation in my career that we've had. And you can see the photo shows a National Guard truck helping to clear some of that debris. So a very significant event for our area. Another significant event that many of you may remember that have been in town for a while was the October flood of 1996. This photo is a picture of the old Blue Point Road at Foxwell Brook. This disaster brought in over $1 million of FEMA reimbursement. It was a 3-day rain event in October. We got over 15 inches of rain. There was widespread flooding, trees, road closures, as you might expect. One resident, actually a very good personal friend of mine, Bob Snow, passed away when he was traveling on this section of road from his home in Blue Point, heading up to Route 1 to help a friend who needed help. And the road gave way underneath his pickup as he went across this bridge. During this 3-day event, we handled, the Scarborough Police and Fire Department handled 350 emergency calls for service, and we ended up losing a 36-inch water main that was out for 3 days. So a very significant event for our community. Then, of course, the ice storm of 2008, over $500,000 of FEMA eligible reimbursement. 90% of our community was without power. 50 roads or sections of roads were closed. We had 302 emergency calls in a 48-hour period. We did open the high school emergency shelter. We housed about 65 citizens. Numerous trees down, and the storm debris from this event was really the biggest challenge for the community. There was just a ton of branches and damage on private and public property. So those were 3 examples on the local level. Because in the news lately, you can't escape some of the national examples, including the California wildfires. This is an example of an emergency that involves the EMAC, or the Emergency Management Assistant Compact, because when local communities are overwhelmed and it goes to the county and then the state, once the state has exceeded their capacities, they reach out through the EMAC, and that's where we bring wildland firefighters from across the nation to deploy to these types of wide-scale disasters. They bring apparatus with them, planes, dozers, and that's an example of how resources from one state will go to another state to help out. The same thing happened, obviously, in 9/11 during the terrorist attack. Firefighters from across our nation deployed for rescue and recovery efforts in an event that lasted for 8 months by the time everything was cleaned up. At the bottom, it mentions USAR teams. That stands for Urban Search and Rescue. And DEMT teams, which stands for Disaster Emergency Medical Teams. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation, these teams are just individual groups that form in various states or communities or parts of states. We actually have a couple of our paramedics that belong to my department that belong to the local DMAT team. And they've been deployed, actually Lieutenant Contreras, who works for me, deployed 3 times in 1 year to the hurricanes in Puerto Rico, the Houston area, and I'm sorry, but I forget the third one, but there were 3 in 1 season. They also deployed during the COVID pandemic, early in the pandemic. You may have remembered a cruise ship that came into California that was delayed for several weeks, and our crews and that local DMAT team ended up responding to California to help get those folks off and get them taken care of. So how do we coordinate locally? It all starts with what we call emergency management team briefings, EMT briefings. Scarborough is really fortunate in that all of the departments around town work very well together. We've, over the years, developed a great culture of working as a team. And when there's, for example, a hurricane in the Caribbean that's starting to threaten us, several days out, we generally have notice and we'll start getting weather briefings from the National Weather Service. And we'll start disseminating that to the department heads and members of the emergency management team to give them some advanced warning as it gets closer and starts to become a real threat for our area. We start meeting for actual in-person briefings where all the different department heads will explain what they're doing in their preparations, just for some situational awareness so that everybody has an idea what each other's doing. We all have our own individual roles and responsibilities, but it's always nice to have that coordinated between the different agencies that have to come together, Public Works, Police, Fire, EMS, during these types of events. EOC stands for Emergency Operating Center. We are fortunate in Scarborough here that we have our own dispatch center and what they call a PSAP, which is a public safety answering point. Those are the folks that actually, when you dial 911, it goes to one of 24 PSAPs in the state of Maine, and Scarborough is one of those. So we actually receive the 911 calls here and dispatch the fire and police and public works folks right out of our dispatch center in the public safety building. That really gives us a great opportunity to get our hands around emergency operations coordination, and has worked very well. We have a shelter. The Scarborough High School is designated not only as Scarborough's public shelter, but is also a regional shelter. One of the things that we have experienced with disasters over the years is that every community likes to have their own shelter, but staffing a shelter for the Red Cross and for the volunteers that it takes to do it and do it well is very labor intensive, and that there really aren't enough resources to do that. So we've developed a program where we've certified certain facilities in the area to be regional shelters, where we'll take folks in from not only Scarborough, but South Portland, Cape, and other surrounding communities. And we try to only open up enough shelters where it's convenient to get there, but also efficient for the resources that we have to operate them. During our coordination and during our gear up for a response, our priorities are always, the safety of our first responders, and then our first mission is the opening of roads to make sure that 911 calls can be responded to and that folks can evacuate. So keeping the roads open is always one of our biggest priorities. That's why a lot of times when you see how long it takes for power restoration, a lot of that is because when we first start an operation, particularly with one with power outages, the first thing the CMP crews do is go around and ground lines and make safe so that the public works crews can go in and trim trees and cut debris out of the road safely without being impacted. And then once we have all the roads open and everything made safe in town, then we come back and we start doing the restoration phase of the disaster and putting power back on in places. But there's always a lag in putting power back until we have an opportunity to make everything safe for our first responders so we can get to all areas of town, particularly those dead end roads or roads where we only have one way in and one way out. So that's kind of how we do things on the local level. Then on the national level, we've created a number of systems so that things work when we're out of state or dealing with folks that we don't deal with on a regular basis. You might imagine that although firefighting is firefighting across the nation, we all do things a little bit differently. And more importantly, we talk differently. We refer to things differently. We have slang. And in the old days, if you might remember some of the old TV programs, we used to use a lot of 10 codes. 10-8 is I'm on the way, and 10-19 meant I'm returning to the station. The unfortunate part was that 10-8 and 10-19 might have meant something completely different in California. So nationally, particularly after 911, a lot of these systems came into play where we now have an incident command system. It's called ICS. And it is something that all disciplines train and use and implement for every day-to-day operation. But it's a system that is scalable. And as a situation grows, you'd grow your incident management system to be able to maximally take care of it. So in the fire service, we've really embraced this and have found that it works real well. No matter the size of an incident, if we go to a grass fire or a trash can fire, the first unit off, the first person there in charge, regardless of their rank, takes command and announces that he is in command and reports what he has going and what he's going to do. And if that trash can fire turns into a building fire, we just add additional layers and segments and sections and expand it to meet the need of that situation. And the same system works in a small structure fire in Scarborough or a hurricane that involves multiple states. It works seamlessly. NIMS is the National Incident Management System, and this is all built on interagency operability. So one of the other things that we've standardized is resource typing and credentialing. When you take, for instance, a fire truck. Fire trucks come in all kinds of sizes, shapes, and capacities. There's different sizes of water tanks. There's different horsepower and gallons per minute flows that they can flow. So we've developed this system to type all of the different types of apparatus or pieces of equipment so that they meet predetermined requirements. So if I need to call New Hampshire to get a fire pump truck, and I know I need 1,000 gallon per minute truck with 4 men that are trained to fight structural firefighters, that's a type 1 fire truck. Similarly, if California needs a forestry unit with 3,000 gallons of water, that's a particular type of tanker that would end up responding to California. And we do the same thing with credentialing. If you are a certified firefighter, there's a credential that goes with that. If you are a member of the planning team in the incident command system, then there is a credentialing process to be a planner so that you have the requisite training and the credentials to be able to deploy, and the folks at the other end know exactly what you're capable of doing and how you can fit into that incident command system using the NIMS principles of managing. So with that kind of is the first section, an overview of emergency management, kind of how it started and things that, how we work on the local level and how things work on the national level. So Nancy, I guess I'll open it up. Are there any questions so far?
You've got everybody mesmerized. Nobody's had a chance to type anything into the chat yet. So don't hesitate, folks. If you've got a question for Mike, I will pass it along as we have these breaks in his presentation. Mike, one of the things you mentioned was sheltering, and it may come up later as well, but there's been a new emphasis on having pets sheltered as well. Could you talk about CART a little bit?
I can. That is indeed something that's new within the last few years. We really have understood, and some of this came out of Katrina and some of those disasters where we found that a lot of folks would be really hesitant to go to a shelter if they couldn't bring their family pets with them. So now part of the requirements to be a certified shelter is to have the capability to deal with pets. And we have done that in our planning at the Scarborough High School. We have a section downstairs all planned for that. We have a animal rescue team set up that has the tools and the plastic sheeting and food and all the things necessary to help us get that set up in a sheltering situation so that folks can bring their pets with them and know that they'll be taken care of.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions for you.
Excellent.
Is the relationship with CMP a good one, or do they pressure you to get going on the road so they can do their work?
No, we do have a positive relationship with CMP. It certainly is different today than it was years ago. I I will be honest and tell you that they have far fewer resources available than they did, say, 25 or 30 years ago. During the ice storm of 2008, for example, we formed a kind of an ad hoc team here. We called it Scarborough Power and Light, but it was a number of, veteran firefighters and folks that had some advanced training, but we had some local CMP employees that were members of the fire department who were troubleshooters, and we, as a local community, know the priorities, and they gave us some resources. We had crews that stayed right in Scarborough. We were able to prioritize our how we wanted to restore power and what areas needed to be worked on. We had all the resources from Public Works, bucket trucks, trained arborists. So we were really able to do great things during that disaster. Today, when widespread power outages occur, CMP brings in a lot of contracted folks. They don't have the personnel that they used to have. So having a dedicated supervisor and a couple of crews and tree trucks here dedicated to Scarborough or a section of Scarborough just doesn't happen like it used to. We funnel all our requests now through the Emergency Operations Center and through the county EMA, and we prioritize at that level, and CMP deploys a lot of different contracted crews to the sites as they are prioritized. But it's still a positive relationship. It's a monumental task.
We have another question. How long did the 1,500 people have to stay at the high school during the hurricane?
Wow, that was Hurricane Bob, and that was a while ago. My memory is it wasn't a terribly long time. Most folks were able to find a place of their own to go, even if they couldn't go home. We didn't have a ton of damage. There was some down at Higgins Beach, certainly had some damage, but there weren't a number of homes that were damaged to the point where folks had to stay a long time. So it was a relatively short stay.
Okay, back to your Geiger counter. Not sure if you said this, but do you still do radiation checks? If so, will radon trigger that Geiger counter? I would think we have a lot of radon in our ledge.
We do have a lot of radon, and you can pick it up on the Geiger counter. We don't routinely do those anymore. I know they're still monitoring at Maine Yankee, and I know the state still keeps track of background radiation, but we don't locally have to do that any longer.
Okay, I think that's it for now, Mike. We'll keep on rolling here, and I welcome questions as people think of them.
Sounds good. So the next section, we're going to chat a little bit about personal preparedness. And the whole priority here is to make sure that folks understand that when a disaster strikes, governments and first responders really need to set priorities for the greater good during the early stages of a disaster. And that's why we preach the 72 hours is really something that folks need to take to heart and plan for, to be self-sufficient for the first 72 hours. There just isn't any way that we can be everywhere for everyone during a disaster of these types of magnitudes. It's funny, over my career, just in what folks call the rescue for, and cut fingers and bloody noses you would never think to call the rescue back when I first started. And now it seems like society has changed, and folks just call 911 for every little tiny thing that happens. And the same thing happens during a disaster, and it's really important that folks be prepared and be prepared to pretty much be on their own for the first 72 hours. And you do that by go kits. Here is just a flyer that is readily available at the ready.gov site, but talks about some of the things that's important to think about when you're putting your go kit together. And Nancy is an absolute expert on this. She lugs one with us to every event that we go to. So I'll let her speak to some of the important things that she has in hers, if you'd like to, Nance.
Well, I think what you've got there is the basic list, Mike. And having experienced shelters now, I offer little tips occasionally for people that I do training for. One of them is earplugs, um, and bring your own pillow. Also bringing even to the shelter, bring some food and water because it does take the shelter staff a while to get up and running. But make your kit portable. I do a demonstration kit. I go out and speak to community groups on preparedness with a Go kit. My Go kit is in a very large dorm trunk on wheels because I have everything in it from shelter, heavy plastic, rope, tent stakes. I even have a large spackle bucket or utility bucket, which could be utilized as a toilet. So there's a lot that you can pack into a Go kit, and it's just portable enough. I can just lift it into my trunk. So if I ever needed to truly take off and run, I've got really enough to essentially let me camp somewhere if I needed to. Things like money. Don't forget some emergency cash, as it says here. We think we're going to live with plastic, but if the power's out or we're in some sort of a makeshift situation, there's not going to be an ATM or a credit card reader. So be sure you have emergency cash enough for a couple nights stay and some food. And then the ready.gov site, as well as the American Red Cross site, both have wonderful lists with a great deal of detail, including details about water. You should have 72 hours of water. That's a gallon per day per person, which isn't quite enough, but at least it will keep you with some hydration and some hygiene. So I really recommend that you go to the ready.gov. Also, at the end of the slides tonight, we have the link to the library's website. We have a very robust section on our library website on resiliency with a lot of emergency preparedness information. So enough from me. Thanks, Mike.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. So the next thing we always talk about when we do these presentations is making a plan. Start by thinking about what type of disasters affect our area. Weather events is certainly one. Flooding is the most common disaster in Maine and pretty much across the country. But think about what types of disasters might happen. Establish a family meeting place is really important. If you live in a vulnerable area or if you have to evacuate, my advice is always to think beyond our community. Where do you have relatives inland, for example, if it's a coastal storm, or even out of state if you needed to go? Identify the specific needs for your family. Are there any special needs, prescriptions or things that may not be on the ordinary list of on ready.gov or the Red Cross site that are specific to your family? And needs change. Understand that needs change. Update your plan and your Go kit accordingly to make sure that you haven't forgotten anything. Have a communications and evacuation plan. One of the things that is really difficult is communicating during a disaster. A lot of folks now are using cell phones extensively or exclusively, and when everybody is on there at the same time, sites fail and cell towers go down or get over capacity. A lot of times it's better to text instead of talking. It uses less bandwidth, and more people can text than can actually get through with a true telephone call. Set up a schedule so that you know who you're going to contact. As a storm approaches, if it's a coastal storm, for example, and somebody lives inland, have everybody in the family know that at such a time every morning and every night, that's when we'll call and check in and let you know that everything's all right, so folks aren't worrying throughout the day. If you can, pick someplace to go out of town or away from the coast versus depending on the public shelter. I always preach that the public shelter should be a last resort, and if you've spent a couple of nights in one, you'll understand why. They're not terribly comfortable. It really is intended to be the shelter of last resort, because we certainly couldn't take care of the capacity of our entire community. When shelters are planned, we generally use an average of like a 10% number to target as to the need of a community. But the last thing you want to do is spend a couple of nights on a very uncomfortable cot in a gymnasium of a high school if you don't have to. Certainly there are times when you may need to, but if you are a good planner and think ahead, oftentimes you can find a much more comfortable place to weather the storm. Know how you're going to get there. Plan your evacuation routes out. Most places you can get out more than one different way. You don't want to get in Scarborough, for example. We think that if we get to the turnpike, we're all set. Well, there's a couple of spots between here and Biddeford where there's some low areas that often flood, and sometimes I've seen the turnpike where you couldn't even get through. So know what your options are and plan a couple of alternate routes just in case. And probably the most important thing about being prepared is to follow directions. Folks in my business and don't take these things lightly. We study storms. We understand that nobody likes to evacuate. Everybody would prefer to stay home when they can. So before we issue an advisory or ask folks to evacuate, know and understand that it is done based on evidence and need. And it really is critically important that you monitor the situation and follow local officials' advice and directions. And to do that, you need the tools to do so. So if the power's out, you need a radio, a battery operated radio or a crank up radio, because your cell phone may not last and you may not have power. Any questions on the personal preparedness stuff, Nance?
Not yet. We'll give folks just a minute here. I will mention kind of a fun story. I was in one of these, I don't remember which storm it was, but I got one of those wonderful new crank radios. And guess what? The power was out and I couldn't see the controls. I had a devil of a time trying to figure out. Fortunately, I have a headlamp as well, so that's what I finally dug out. But it was pretty ironic for me to have this emergency radio that I couldn't use because I couldn't see anything. So lesson learned, know your equipment. Any questions from folks at this point? There we go. If there's flooding, are there maps or directions available so we know how to get out of town safely?
So there are evacuation signs, and you may have seen them. There's blue hurricane. We actually got them through a grant after a hurricane. There are a number of ones that show the directions coming out of the coastal areas that'll direct you to the evacuation routes and towards the public shelter at the high school. But there aren't any maps that I'm aware of locally. It really is just a matter of knowing and following the directions as we put it out during that event.
Yeah, Mike, how do you get information out to the community about road closures and bridges out and that sort of thing? What should people be monitoring at that point?
So we work with all the media outlets. So we get it out through TV, radio, and certainly social media. Once again, it's a matter of we try to blast it out to as many different places as we can, not knowing who's going to have resources to be able to retrieve it. That's why we use the radio stations as well as the TV and social media outlets.
You mentioned bandwidth and using text. I remember during Hurricane Sandy, I had family in New Jersey, and I would get in touch with them to let them know what I was picking up for road closures and bridges out, because their local resources were so either non-existent or completely bogged down, no cell service, that I was able to reach to them and say, okay, if you're coming to Maine, these are the highways that you can use, or this particular, obviously the major bridges coming out of New Jersey and New York, those were very important to know about. So sometimes your information may not be from a local source. You may have to go out of the ring and then learn more that way.
That's a That's
Go
a
ahead.
great point, Nancy, and that's kind of what I was trying to get to when I was talking about the communication plan and using someone from away. If you have a family member or a contact out of state, sometimes it's a lot easier to monitor what's going on where they are than it is here, and to make that plans to communicate just as you described.
We have a question. Are there any radio stations that we should tune to locally? Is it AM or FM? Any particular recommendations there?
No, there are a number of them, and we try to blast it out to all of them. So, and they're all pretty good about putting it out. So all of the popular stations in the area generally are cooperating with us to get that information out.
I know in some really big events, there have been sort of rogue social media sites as well that will try to capture information and make it available to communities, but that tends to be the really big disaster events. Okay, Mike, I think we can move along here and we'll have time at the end. Thanks.
Sounds good. So the next section is to chat a little bit about resiliency. And I thought I sat with just a quick history of the program that we put together. We worked with a fellow named Ron Brazil, who was a local psychologist. He ended up getting a grant along with Alpha One, which many of you may be familiar with. They're a nonprofit that works with the disabled community. And Dr. Brazil himself is missing a hand and is disabled. So he was looking for a project that would help disabled folks with resiliency. And we ended up stumbling upon him with this grant opportunity. And he got talking about how it was important for public safety folks to be resilient. And that turned into a relationship, and we really, Chief Moulton and I, the police chief, recognized the value of this program within our own agencies. Our folks, unfortunately, see a wide range of things, and the ability of our employees to cope with some of what they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis varies widely. I've got, 30, 40-year veteran members who have seen pretty much everything there is to see, and generally have formed the coping skills and seem to do okay with it. But at that same call, I may have an 18 or 20-year-old college kid that has never seen a traumatic injury or somebody that has passed away. And so there's a wide range of need to develop resilient skills. One of the things Chief Moulton and I always struggled with was when we have one of these bad calls, when do we bring in the critical incident stress debriefing process? And, like I said, we're so diverse that it's sometimes difficult. So the idea with this project is to teach the skills in advance so that folks are naturally resilient themselves. And then it becomes less often that you need to deal with the critical incidents. And FEMA has, over the last few years, changed direction and kind of set the goals towards community-wide resiliency in their operations. So it's just a great way to be proactive. The reason we teach these skills is because everyone deals with adversity at some point in their lives. These are not disaster-related skills. They're really universal skills. We all struggle with relationships, economic challenges, substance abuse challenges. There is nobody that goes through life without facing some kind of adversity. Certainly public safety personnel deal with a lot of traumatic and disturbing events, but it's really all about being proactive versus reactive. And one of the things that they've studied is that communities that are resilient seem to be more self-sufficient and able to recover from disasters quicker and more efficiently. And one of the examples that Dr. Brazil cited was the example of the tsunami in Japan at the power plant and Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And if you look back at some of the news feeds of the day, you see in Hurricane Katrina, there's a lot of poverty in that area. There were a lot of folks, really up against it, looking for help, and The contrast was in Japan, there's a lot of respect and there's a lot of caring for family members is just built into their lives and their being, and they just seem to come together and take care of each other better than some of the folks in the United States. There's different examples, and folks have argued as to whether that's true or not, but the bottom line is if you work together and you are self-sufficient, a community can recover quicker and more efficiently. So what is resilience? It's the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. It just means bouncing back from difficult experiences, and that comes from the American Psychological Association. So Dr. Brazil kind of boiled these down into 11 resiliency skills and attitudes that he found really work well. And this is the program that we've been offering to our first responders. We did it through the library and a number of public sessions. We've talked to businesses about it, and we feel that this is a great way to start. And if folks think about these, I think you'll see that a lot of it really makes a lot of sense. So the first one is being connected to others. Relationships certainly provide support and caring and nurturing. It's important to have a number of these relationships, both inside and outside the family. One of the things that I've always preached, and Chief Moulton too, is you can't be associated with firefighters or police officers all day long. You need to have other friends and other interests so that you're not constantly talking and thinking about emergency services. The same thing applies to everybody. You need inside and outside relationships because they are the source of love and reassurance and encouragement. So developing and maintaining and keeping new relationships is really important, being connected. The second skill, and this is a big one, is being flexible. It really is a critical skill to be resilient. You need to be flexible not only in your thinking, but also your actions. During a disaster, things don't always go the way you think they're going to go. You may start down a path and think that, okay, this is what I need to do right now based on these circumstances. And then all of a sudden something really changes dramatically. And being flexible and thinking on your feet and being able to change direction and do something different than what you had originally planned is really important. You have to be willing and able to try something new or a different approach. Oops. Number 3, being able to make realistic plans and take action. A lot of folks, when something happens, they panic and they freeze. And certainly that's no way to operate when you need to make a difference. So understanding the difference between what is versus what you'd like it to be, being proactive instead of reactive, being assertive and moving in a direction, instituting change, versus being aggressive and getting all upset or being passive and not doing anything at all. You need to be willing to learn something new and to follow through and execute. So it's really important to learn to be able to make plans and to take action to help yourself, to help your family, and to help others in the community. Being able to communicate well and problem solve seems like a no-brainer. You really have to have some basic communication skills. You need to be a good listener and show compassion, develop some problem solving skills, and really be able to work as a team member within the community. We do this every day in public safety because we work as a group, but it's equally important for civilians in the community to be able to communicate well and problem solve with their neighbors or members of their homeowners association or neighborhood. Number 5, being able to manage strong feelings. Everybody is going to be upset and stressed during these types of events. So to have the ability to set aside that emotion and to take action without being impulsive, and to manage those strong emotions and still be able to get the task at hand done is really important. You know, in stressful situations like this, you want to think before acting while you're angry or hurt. You know, make sure that you're making reasoned decisions and managing those strong feelings before you make your plan and start executing. Number 6, you need to be self-confident. You need to have a positive self-image and know that you are able to make a difference, and that that confidence will help you make a difference. Understand that the actions can help yourself and others. If you have a self-defeated attitude going in, odds are you're not going to be successful. But if you're confident and you have, you know that you can make a difference and you have that positive self-image, then you will be able to contribute and come out of the right end of it. Number 7, being able to find purpose and meaning in life. It's important to be able to make sense out of what is happening. A lot of times, you know, spiritual and religious practices factor in this skill. Act and stay true to your values. You know, that's really what it's all about. Number 8, being able to see the big picture. You know, this is a little bit of a challenge for optimists. I mean, optimists find this easier than pessimists, but, you know, at the end of the day, this crisis is temporary versus permanent. You know, this too will pass. You can't get too pervasive. You don't want to blame others. You know, you need to hold yourself accountable and be optimistic that we are going to get through this. As bad as it is today, it's going to be better tomorrow, and it's going to be better than that the day afterwards. It's really important not to get pervasive and down. Being able to appreciate and use humor appropriately. I think laughter has a tremendous healing power. Just think about it. If you're not feeling well and you watch a funny movie or read a funny book, it just naturally perks you up. And it's something, when I first started in fire and EMS, I used to really enjoy, when I first started to go to EMS calls. You know, I belonged to a small company, and a lot of times the calls were for folks that I knew in the community. And to go in and crack a little bit of a joke to help them feel a little bit better as you're starting to care for them and understand what's going on, it breaks the ice, and it really starts that interaction off on a positive foot. Now, because you have to be a little bit cautious, because sometimes humor can be misinterpreted or used inappropriately, but being able to appreciate and use humor a lot of times when the chips are down is very helpful and effective. Number 10, being able to care for yourself is extremely important. You know, you need to take care of yourself physically through proper rest, diet, and exercise. You need to take care of your financial health by being well organized and saving regularly and knowing where your important documents are, and just being in a good place in your own fiscal health. It's really tough to take care of others if your own house isn't in order. So taking care of yourself and is really important. And finally, being able to take care for others. That has a healing effect and really builds resiliency. There's all kinds of opportunities to volunteer, to help others in nursing homes, hospitals, food banks, shelters. I think that's what drives, I know it is what drives me, but most people in public safety, there is just a tremendous feeling from helping other people, and that helps you become more resilient yourself. So those are the 11 skills. As Nancy mentioned before, the website on the library website, there's a resiliency section that is just full of all of this information, plus tons and tons more. There are some videos on there that Chief Moulton and I and a number of other folks did that talk about different challenges that we had in our careers. And a lot of times storytelling can be a real positive skill. There's preparedness materials available on the FEMA.gov website, as we mentioned. Nancy, anything else you want to add to that?
I'll take the question we have first from the group here. We have in our book, we had an example of communication really relying on ham radio operators. So the question from our group is, how many ham radio operators do we have around here?
You know, there is a group, they call them RACIs, but there's a number of folks that Cumberland County EMA has a list of them, and they're available to come out into the local communities. And ham radio is a very effective tool. We've used it when different other communication tools were down, and it works extremely well.
Okay, Michael, this event has been so informative. Thank you. And to all who planned and helped with this presentation, thanks to you as well. Thank you, Jessica.
Well, thank you.
I do want to put in just a plug for public libraries involved in emergency preparedness and response. There's a greater interest throughout the country now in libraries getting involved in their communities to help prepare communities as well as help them recover after disasters. So you've heard me step in a couple of times here with our perspective. It's because the Scarborough Public Library is really a team player with the town's emergency management program. And I'm also involved on behalf of the library in a couple of other programs. One is called Southern Maine COAD, which stands for Southern Maine Community Organizations Active in Disaster. And we would help coordinate volunteers after a disaster occurs. And the coordination of volunteers is important because volunteers, although well-meaning, can also get in the way if they're not given particular directions or work to do that's helpful. So our public library is very active in the emergency management world. I've received a lot of training through Mike's programs that he mentioned on the slides. Our library also was involved in the Cultural Emergency Response Coalition. So if there was a major disaster at a cultural institution, there's some training available. So I just mentioned that it's not a typical role that you think of for public libraries, but in fact, across the country now we are seen as essential services, and more of us are getting that kind of training on behalf of our communities. So want to put that pitch in, and there'll probably be a little more about that during the program that's called It's Your Chance, volunteering during the pandemic and beyond. So we look forward to sharing that information then as well.
And Nancy's very modest. I just need to put my own plug in for her and the work that she and her staff have done. I mean, there's been a number of occasions over the years where the library has played a critical role in helping with shelter staffing. We had a significant fire in a multi-tenant commercial building, and they were part of the emergency response team that went in and helped with the Scarborough Economic Development Corporation in finding temporary space. And we've had disasters where there's been private disaster relief that needed applications filled out, and forms where they've had the community come in and facilitated applying for their private disaster relief. So there's just so many different things that the library has the capability and the expertise to do, and it's all because of Nancy's leadership and what she's put into the program over the years. We can't thank you enough, Nance. Well,
thank you. That's nice. Well, certainly I get a lot out of it, as does the library. So appreciate that. We do have a few more nice comments here. And this is a good one from Jessica. Mike, so these skills are also important. How long do you allow a new employee to develop these skills? If you see a rookie without them or some of them, or perhaps acting inappropriately, is that something you work on? What if it happens later in the career?
Yeah, it is. And actually, we've kind of taken this program to the next level now. in that we now have a formal peer support program. So we've taken some of our core folks. Actually, they were folks that volunteered and wanted to do it, but they were also nominated by their peers. And the whole concept here is that, once again, everybody struggles with adversity and things in their own life. And unrelated to their work in public safety, we want to make sure our folks are just in good shape anyway. So the idea of peer support, folks, is that in every one of our shifts, we have folks that are specifically trained to be able to pick up on the subtle cues when somebody might be struggling with whatever it is. And there's additional training that we've provided them. There's resources that we've provided for them so that, it doesn't need to rise to the level of Chief Thurlow realizing that I've got somebody that's struggling with this, that, or the other thing. A lot of times there's a lot more conversation going on at the kitchen table between two peers on the floor, and they know what's going on, and we've empowered them to provide the resources and steer them in the right direction without it ever having to get to the point of a critical incident stress debriefing or getting up to our level. And that's really been a successful program. The police and fire department have both formalized that over the last couple of years.
Eddie Perry says, thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Brenda wants to know who works as the liaison with the Red Cross.
Who works as the liaison?
Mm-hmm.
Who is our current Red Cross liaison? Is that what you mean?
Brenda, if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead. I think you're allowed to. Yeah, there you go.
Yes. Yeah. Who works in conjunction with the Red Cross? Would that be you, Chief Thurlow?
Yeah, the Red Cross comes to, we have monthly emergency management, what they call local directors meeting at Cumberland County EMA. And the Red Cross has a member. Cumberland County always has one of their folks at that meeting. So we communicate, know each other on a first name basis. And whenever there's a need for sheltering, or a lot of times the Red Cross helps out with folks from a fire or any other disaster where they provide one-on-one resources. So we've got them all on our speed dial, and either I or our senior staff will make that call.
Thank you.
Carmen says, thank you to all and for the additional resources. Our pleasure, Carmen. Jean says, kudos to the library for such a proactive involvement in the community. Thank you, Jean. And Tom, our tech guru in the background, our wizard behind the curtain there, wants to remind everyone that the libraries provide power and internet backup access for warming, cooling, disasters. We don't have a generator, but as long as we've got power, we actually extend our hours to accommodate the community if there is a need for that kind of sheltering. And at this point, if anybody would like to make a comment, you are now able to unmute yourself and feel free to make any comments or ask any questions that you might like.
Yes, a big thank you to both of you, to Nancy and to Chief Thurlow. This was very informative and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you as well. And I appreciate knowing the protocol for the power outages. That's very helpful to know that. So I'm glad you clarified that for us. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Chief, are there any long-range plans for raising the bridges on Black Point over the marshes? Because the high tide is getting pretty close to the road.
Yeah, there are. And I know that's one of the things that we do each year. And we actually just went through that process with Mike Shaw, the Public Works Director. The county does a 5-year mitigation plan. And we just went through, there's a number of sites within Scarborough where he's looking to do different projects like that. A lot of it is funding dependent, naturally. That's the biggest impediment. But things like the road height in those areas, the Sawyer Road over the Cape Line is an area where we often get flooding. So we have a whole list of those that are built into the county's hazard mitigation plan. And as we identify funding sources or grant opportunities, those are the ones that would get funded first. That's part of the reason for that planning process, Betty.
Mike, you've been here long enough to know the construction of the section over the Scarborough Marsh that connects Oak Hill to Dunstan, essentially, and it was literally floating logs for a while. And
Oh,
then
yeah,
they've
down at
raised it
very
over the
bottom there,
years.
yeah, it's an old corduroy road to begin with. And then some layers of cement, and now asphalt on top of it. But, you know, back when I was younger, I remember that road flooding constantly.
Right.
That road's been elevated significantly from what it was. I remember many times myself plowing part of the road to get debris and seaweed out of the road so you could get by. It's amazing how things change over the years.
Well, I want to just mention, as somebody who sat in on some of the emergency briefings prior to a big disaster, what a really impressive experience it was to see the departments, and I'm sure it's true in other communities. Scarborough, I always feel, is very special, but regardless, the process of coordination in emergency preparedness is really, really interesting. And we can all be very proud of our emergency management agencies and all of our local communities. These are, in some cases, for very small towns, these are not professional people. They are people who do it as a volunteer job, in quotes. We're very fortunate to have highly trained professionals in Greater Portland, but what an honor to sit in and listen to the kind of planning that goes on. Everything from, you know, do we need to stage equipment on a high ground somewhere? And, you know, Mike mentioned the MOUs. We already know that we can use that parking lot. We know how many buses there are in town and how many people they'll hold. So if we have to evacuate a large area, we know how many people can be transported. Just the level of detail in an emergency plan is really amazing. So I just want to put a pitch in for those of us who typically don't get to see behind the scenes. It's really a remarkable process. Anybody else? Well, Jessica says, thank you so much. Such an interesting and important job. Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Here, here.
Well, folks, I do want to, again, just remind you of some of the programs that we still have in our series. It's been quite a really packed grouping of programming, and just something we should all be very proud of in our communities. But upcoming on our community series, community read series, is we've still got 2 more book discussion groups. We've got one tomorrow morning at 10:30 and one next Tuesday evening at 6:30. That's the 10th. And then this weekend, we have a live reading of Our Town by professional actors from Lyric Theater, Royal River Community Players, and other great local theaters. That's on Saturday at 2. And then the following Saturday on the 14th at 3 is a program called Everything Moves. And this is patrons and librarians of Anchorage Public Library. They'll be sharing their memories and photographs of the Great Alaskan Earthquake of 1964. And then Wednesday, the 18th, we welcome back author John Mueller. And if you missed his first talk, it is on video on each community library website, so you can check out that first program. And then another program coming up on Monday, November 16th at 6:30. This is the one I alluded to that's now called It's Your Chance, Volunteering During the Pandemic and Beyond. And that's going to be a program that talks about how you can volunteer, but also how things have changed for volunteer opportunities since March. Obviously, safety and distancing is an issue, so we have different opportunities now. You'll learn how your help is needed, how to do it safely, and some of the national and worldwide trends that are playing out in our local communities. The panelists will include Michael Ashmore, who's the Program Development and Training Officer from Volunteer Maine, Karen Stevenson, who's the Director of Volunteer Engagement at United Way of Greater Portland, and Mary Hadlock, who is the RSVP Volunteer Services Director for Maine, for Southern Maine Agency on Aging. So a lot more to take advantage of. We still have some room for tomorrow morning's book discussion. So if you would like, the registration link is in the chat, but you can also go to the library, our various library websites, I think, and Andy, probably you've got a link on the Thomas Memorial site as well. He's nodding. Thank you. And a big thanks to Andy. Yes, there we go. A big thanks to Andy of the Thomas Memorial Library in Cape Elizabeth, who got the inspiration for the community read. Andy has done so much of the heavy lifting on these programs. So we all thank you, Andy. Big virtual thanks. Ann Willett says, thank you. And Andy says back, thanks for the kind words, Lucy, but it was a total team effort. Well, as somebody who's been just enjoying watching this all happen, I've never introduced myself to all of you, but I am Nancy Kroll, the library director at the Scarborough Public Library. And it has been my pleasure to watch the collaborative effort of all of our libraries working together. It has been such fun to experience it with you, but more importantly, to see how we've shared our resources and made something really terrific together. What a great example of community building for all of us. So my thanks to all of our staff members.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you. Lots of kudos coming up in the chat still. And Kate Mitchell says, indeed, Andy, thank you so much. And then Andy back. Such a great way to spend a difficult time. Indeed. Thanks, everyone. Well, we'll say good night to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And this is being recorded. We appreciate you coming tonight, and be sure and check out the link and share the link with others. This is an important topic, obviously, and we're very pleased that you were able to join us tonight. So stay safe and thanks for joining us.
Good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.